So now that the writers and directors of Avengers Endgame have tried to explain Captain America's terrible ending into the ground, the most recent explanation being Steve Rogers was somehow always Peggy's husband, let's talk about how no matter how many explanations they come up with post-ending, or how many previous scenes they choose to retcon, Captain America's ending still makes absolutely no sense. Not with Peggy's character, not with Steve's character, certainly not with the rules of time travel established in the movie, and certainly not with the character development Steve went through over the course of like 10 plus years. Let's start with the time travel rules explained in Avengers Endgame. We have an uncomfortably long scene where Rhodey and Scott name a bunch of movies nobody under the age of 10 has heard of to drive home the fact that the time travel in this movie is unlike those other movies. You can't just go back in time and change the past in order to alter the future. The direct quote spoken was, "Change in the past doesn't change the future, and any deviation will result in a different timeline." Right? Right? That's an unequivocal fact of this movie. So now let's read off what Cap's ending was. Steve Rogers goes back in time and remains there to live out his life with Peggy Carter, and then returns to the present in the same timeline as an elderly man to pass on the shield. How the hell was he allowed to do that? And here's where I would have put the in-universe explanation, except they didn't give one. The movie just ends, and it's left up to interpretation. This movie, that was supposed to be the conclusion of 22 movies and the culmination of 10 plus years of storytelling, was just left up to interpretation. Like, this is an Avengers movie, it's not Inception. It should have an actual conclusion. And since they didn't explain Steve's ending at all in the movie, the directors and the writers are now coming up with explanations post-movie at cons and interviews and such on how Steve was allowed to do that. But unfortunately for them, and unfortunately for us who actually cared about his character, none of the explanations work. Also, the fact that the explanations given from the directors and the writers of the same movie are completely different should tell you enough. The first explanation is given by the screenwriters of Endgame, and I'm directly quoting here. "That is our theory. We are not experts on time travel. But the Ancient One specifically states that when you take an Infinity Stone out of a timeline, it creates a new timeline. So Steve going back and just being there would not create a new timeline. So I reject the Steve is in an alternate reality theory." So they're basically saying as long as you don't mess with the Infinity Stones, you won't create a new timeline. Okay. But if that were true, wouldn't this entire movie be redundant? Then the whole plot of this movie, trying to obtain the Infinity Stones, is unnecessary. Then Rhodey was right when he said they should just kill baby Thanos. Like, the movie that they wrote would completely fall apart with this explanation. If Steve can go back in time and change Peggy's story in the same timeline with the no consequences, then they all should be able to do whatever they want with no consequences. So needless to say, this explanation makes no sense unless they want to completely destroy their main plotline. Moving on. Then there's the explanation given by the directors of the movie, the Russos. And they say, if Cap were to go back into the past and live there, he would create a branched reality. He lived his married life in a different universe from the main one. He had to make another jump back to the main universe at the end to give the shield to Sam. Alright, with the cardinal rule of Endgame that change in the past doesn't change the future, it creates an alternate timeline, the first part of this does check out. Unfortunately, the second part doesn't. At all. Because there is no jump to the main universe. He was already there. While everyone else is staring at the time portal waiting for Steve to come out of it, Steve is chilling 15 feet away, seemingly there the whole time. Like, the only way he can be in an alternate timeline and in the original timeline at the end is if he came out of the time portal thing. But then they specifically show us that he doesn't, which completely derails the argument for him being in an alternate timeline. So now this explanation of being in an alternate timeline doesn't work either, because if he just walked into the original timeline without any portal or external device, he was always in the original timeline. And then once again, this violates the cardinal rule that change in the past doesn't change the future. So Steve's character really is just stuck in limbo. He's not in an alternate timeline, and he can't be in the same one, because with the choices made and the rules established, neither of those are possible. I've heard some people speculate that maybe he used the bracelet thing to return to the current timeline, except they specifically call it a time GPS. So you use it to move forward or backward in time. If Steve married Peggy and then moved forward in time using the bracelet, he would just be in the future in the timeline where he married Peggy. He wouldn't be where Sam and Bucky are at the end. So again, it doesn't work. So then the last theory from the screenwriters, probably realizing their initial theory killed their entire movie, came up with an even worse one. In their minds, Marcus and McFeely always intended for Steve to be the father of Peggy's children, essentially making Endgame's last scene part of a closed time loop where Steve was Peggy's husband all along. So throughout all the events of the MCU. First of all, I can't sleep at night because Mark Ruffalo's voice is ingrained in my head, just constantly going, change in the past doesn't change the future. And these dudes are out here just making shit up as they go along, ignoring the one rule of time travel that they came up with. Sir, there are no time loops if any change creates a branched reality. That was your rule. Just stop. You messed up. Stop it. Also, the we intended for Steve to be Peggy's husband all along. Did you? Did you? Because that would introduce some weird incest into what is essentially a Disney movie. Is that the story y'all want to stick with? That's what y'all want to do? Okay. Not to mention, they themselves insisted on the Steve Sharon kiss for Civil War, going as far as to say that Steve and Peggy kissed one time in a moving car with Tommy Lee Jones. It wasn't that deep. But now, all of a sudden, it is that deep because they couldn't come up with a better ending for Steve? Okay. And so far, this was just looking at the logistics of it. Logistically, with the rules established and the choices made, like not coming out of the portal, Steve's ending is impossible. Even taking into account all the explanations the writers and directors gave post-movie, it still doesn't work. So now that that's settled, looking into it logistically, let's get into how, character-wise, it doesn't make sense at all, either. Starting with Endgame. My favorite scene that was actually in the trailer, where Steve goes, "Some people move on, but not us." And in the trailer just before that, there's a black and white montage of everyone who got dusted. So you're really like, it's a dramatic line, very in tune to how an Avengers movie usually goes. Nothing weird there. Also, the line makes sense. He just lost both of his best friends, his family, within seconds of each other. Not to mention, half of the entire world's population that he was directly involved in trying to prevent. So, completely understandable for him to be like, I cannot move on from this, right? Yeah, right? Right? Except you watch the movie, and that line is not about Thanos killing Sam or Bucky or anyone at all. He's talking about Peggy. That's who he can't move on from. Bro, what? The woman you kissed one time, which is at this point 13 years ago to you, who lived a long, happy life she was content with, and you know this because she said it to your face, and whose grandniece you hooked up with, we're talking about her? Not Sam and Bucky, who literally got fucking murked in front of you. That scene where he was at the support group, specifically for people whose loved ones died in Thanos' snap, and Marvel thought that was a good time to set up the ending with Peggy. Not only was mentioning Peggy there wildly out of place and disrespectful, but it was also not comparable in the slightest. This man's husband dying abruptly, turning into dust because of Thanos' snap, is not the same as Peggy, whom Steve kissed one time, whom I mention again was happily married with children, peacefully dying at the age of 95. That would have been an appropriate time to mention Bucky, whom was his best friend since childhood, or Sam, who put his entire life on hold for years to support him. That was when they should have been mentioned. People who actually got dusted in the snap. Since he was at a support group for that specifically. In the scene where he's looking at the compass, that was before all of this actually. That was in the very beginning of the movie. That was like days after Sam and Bucky died. But no mention of them at all? What a contrast from this and Infinity War. To almost all his personal moments in Endgame being about Peggy. Out of nowhere! Sam and Bucky died like yesterday in that scene and they had him staring at the compass like the developments of the last 7 movies didn't happen? And the way him looking at the compass was framed, like that was something he always did? Like, no. The only other time he did that in the future was in Captain America 2, watching Peggy's video talking about her husband.
He saved over 1,000 men, including the man who would become my husband, as it turned out.
You know, because she was married with children and lived a full happy life that she was proud of. Like, they put the compass staring scene in there like it was something he did often, when we haven't even seen that thing for like 5 years now. And then the scene where he goes to the 70s, like they didn't even try to convince us of the StevePeggy end. Just comparing it to everyone else's scenes, Tony goes back in time and has a long, insightful conversation with his father. Thor goes back in time and has a sweet, touching scene with his mom. And Steve goes back in time and just stares at Peggy? Like, granted, they couldn't speak because she couldn't know he was there, but they could have cut to a flashback, could have actually let her have a scene, some insight on what she's up to, just anything to give them some substance. Anything other than him just staring at her for 50 seconds straight like a scene from The Office. Like, that was supposed to be their most compelling scene. That was supposed to convince us to disregard all the other movies and believe this is the natural direction of Steve's arc. Get out! Peggy didn't get a single line in this 3-hour movie. Peggy, who was the first female character in the MCU to get her own narrative, Peggy who founded S.H.I.E.L.D., Peggy who didn't let losing Steve be the end of her character, she didn't get a single line and just became this one-dimensional character for a tragic backstory that was already fleshed out. Over the course of 10 years, they wrote that scene like the only movie they watched was Captain America 1. They could have replaced her with a picture of 1940s Brooklyn and it would have had the same effect because she wasn't there as her actual character. She was there to represent an idealized past for Steve. And if they let her speak or have her own narrative, it would have broken that spell. And I'm supposed to think that was a good ending? That was the natural progression of their character? Please! Not to mention, she was most likely married at that point. In The Winter Soldier, we have an entire scene where Peggy tells Steve that she's happy and proud of the life she lived. She was in a hospital bed, suffering from Alzheimer's. She could have said anything here and nobody could hold it against her, but she specifically says her only regret was that he didn't get to live his life. Not that they didn't have to get to have one together, that he didn't get to live his. Like, she moved on just like he did, because they were both written to be well-rounded characters, not static ones who stay exactly the same after 10 years. And Peggy moving on is further solidified in the Agent Carter TV show when the big finale of the first season is Peggy atop the Brooklyn Bridge, Steve's hometown, dropping the last of his super serum blood into the East River and saying goodbye to him. She gets her closure how she can and isn't reduced to the grieving widow archetype. She continues being an agent and eventually creates S.H.I.E.L.D. Steve was not the end-all be-all of her life like Endgame is trying to portray her as. She was a three-dimensional character outside of him. Then in Age of Ultron, Wanda shows Steve that fabricated vision of him dancing with Peggy to mess with his head, and people use that scene as justification that him making the decisions to go back in time in Endgame makes sense. Like, if anything, Age of Ultron solidifies that he would never do that, because by the end of that movie, he explicitly says he doesn't want that life. Like, people remember Wanda's fabricated vision but forget Steve's response to the entire ordeal.
Maybe I should take a page out of Barton's book. Build Pepper a farm, hope nobody blows it up.
The simple life.
You get there one day.
I don't know. Family, stability. Guy who wanted all that went in the ice 75 years ago. I think someone else came out.
You all right?
I'm home.
Like, it's not even subtext. He explicitly states it. He still cares about Peggy, of course, but he's not pining for her like Endgame was trying to portray, because that would be extremely unhealthy. And by this point, after Age of Ultron, it makes no sense for him to choose to abandon everyone and go back in time. That's counterproductive to who his character is. It's not even about who he ends up with at this point. It's about them making his entire character arc meaningless. There were 6 movies with Cap as a main in them leading up to Endgame, where his character is developed over the course of like 10 years. His main arc is about being a man out of time, but a man out of time who moved on, who made the future his home, built a life for himself, and found a family within his team. That's the core of his character. He does all that, but it seems like when writing his emotional narrative for Endgame, they only took into account the end of Captain America 1, completely disregarding his overarching character arc and development from every other movie. Completely disregarding that he saw his best friends die in front of him, and that should have been his motivation in this movie. Like, if you really analyze it, even with all his great fight scenes, Endgame portrays Steve as a stagnant character. Him choosing to go back in time and staying there would have made sense if it was Avengers 1, or maybe the very beginning of the Winter Soldier before he met Sam, talked to Peggy and saw Bucky. But at this point, absolutely not. It makes no sense. And I've heard people try to defend it by being like, yeah, he said all that, but he's allowed to change his mind. And yeah, he is allowed to change his mind. When he went from wanting to go back in time to not wanting that anymore, and considering the future his home, and considering Bucky, Sam, and Natasha his family, that was him changing his mind. That was character development. What they did in Endgame wasn't that. There was no plotline working towards him changing his mind. They started that movie with him staring at the compass, talking about Peggy at the support group for victims of the snap, and acting like Sam and Bucky dying was whatever. That wasn't them writing him as changing his mind. That was them acting like this is how it always was, and the last 5 movies didn't matter. And the second defense I've heard a lot is that Steve's allowed to be selfish. He's allowed to be selfish after seeing Peggy. 1, we just went over if he was written consistently, he wouldn't want to do this. 2, he's allowed to be selfish, but he's allowed to be selfish for himself only. He's not allowed to reroute Peggy's life without her consent. He's not allowed to will her children out of existence because of what he wants. What kind of Snape from Harry Potter ass bullshit is that? She married someone else, dude. She had kids. Move on. Not to mention, if any character is allowed to be selfish and do something as drastic as that, the only one who would have been justified would have been Thor. Thor went to the day his mother got murdered, and he didn't go back in time after it was all said and done to save her. He could have created a branched timeline and lived in his home, lived in a world where his best friend and brother were still alive, and he would be the most justified in doing so. But he didn't, because that would be counterproductive to his entire journey. But for some reason, doing it for Steve's character is a good thing? That's somehow a happy ending? No, that's lazy writing. Like, the 2 options they really gave us for Steve's ending are either Steve goes back in time, abandoning all his friends and marrying Peggy even though she didn't ask, and then doing absolutely nothing to help Bucky while he's getting tortured for 70 years, or stop Hydra from infiltrating his wife's company. Or Steve goes back in time, creating a new timeline, effectively stopping Peggy from marrying her actual husband and willing her children out of existence without her consent, rerouting her entire life and not once taking into account that she wouldn't want this. And to top it all off, in both of those scenarios, he hooked up with his grandniece. In what world would Steve just let Bucky get tortured for 70 years, or watch Peggy go to work every day and not tell her about Hydra for his own personal happy ending? In what world would Steve, with a clear conscience, will Peggy's children out of existence without her consent so he can have her like she's some kind of trophy to him? They keep referring to this as a happy ending. Like, no, this is garbage. It doesn't work in any capacity, but even if it did, it's a shitty ending. It's bad.